Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Grieving Voices. Although if this is your first time listening, welcome. I have my guest today is Shandra Shultz from Healings of Light and Love by Shandra. Welcome, Shandra. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Victoria. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
And today we kind of connected just a little bit before we came on, and it seems like I people that are kind of drawn to be on my podcast, there's always something I can connect with on a personal level. And like right out of the gate, we just started talking about how both of our dads were actually Vietnam vets and were exposed to Agent Orange. And both of our dads both passed away of cancer, different cancers, but I'm sorry for your loss and that we have that thing in common. Um, but there's more to your story than just the loss of your father. And so let's start there. What
Sure.
initially what brought you to wanting to come to the podcast was you had a traumatic brain injury in 2014, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Tell us about that.
So I was driving and a car decided to make a left turn in front of me without seeing me because there was another car blocking it and ended up in a traumatic car accident. I was knocked unconscious, and when I came to, I was very disoriented. I didn't quite know what was going on. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I was like, I don't really recognize this person. Who am I? And it wasn't until the person that I hit was right by my car. I had called. Well, actually, let me step back. I first looked at my phone and something in me said, "Hey, I think I need to call somebody." Just a knowing that I needed to call somebody. So I picked up my phone and I scrolled through it, and nothing looked familiar except the word mom. It stuck out to me, and I said, "Okay, I guess I'll call mom." So I called mom. And I was very, very, like, the tone in my voice was very monotone. I was like, "Hey, I've been in a car accident. Can you come get me?" I wasn't in any way warm, or I had no actual like emotion to my voice. It was just very flat. And I remember my mom's asking me if I was okay, and I said, "I think so, but I don't know." And when when the ambulance showed up, they looked at me and they told me I was fine. So I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm fine. I don't know who I am, but I'm fine." Okay. So I was standing on the side of the road waiting for my mom to show up, and she came, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and that was the only way I was really kind of able to recognize her, is that she looked like me. We both had short brown hair. We had similar facial features. She just looked like me. I was like, "Oh, okay, this must be mom." And she came up to me and said, asked about how I was. And from behind her ran this little 9-year-old child, my daughter, and just grabbed me and screamed, "Mommy." And I just kind of shook, because in that moment I was like, "What? Like, who am I?" And I have a child, like, and I can't remember this. Like, who am I to not be able to remember this child? Like, why don't I remember this child? And it wasn't until I went home with them and started realizing, like, really letting it sink in, that I didn't know them. I didn't remember them. I had pictures of them all around the house they took me to, but I didn't know who they were. Like, I couldn't remember them. And it was like, is this really happening to me? Like, what's going on? But I couldn't tell anybody, because they were just happy I was alive, and I didn't feel like, I didn't want to rain on their parade that I didn't know who they were. So I pretended for probably about a couple of months. I never let them know what was going on. It wasn't until after I met my husband 3 weeks after the accident that I felt comfortable enough with somebody to tell them, "I don't know who these people are."
Wow.
Yeah.
What was that conversation like when you finally
Um,
told them?
so I actually didn't tell my daughter until probably 2 years ago. So the accident was in 2014. I told them in 2019. So it was already 5 years because I didn't know how to tell my daughter that I didn't know them. It was challenging in the process because I remember telling my mom, when I did tell my mom, hey, I'm dealing with this, she didn't believe me at first. It was after I'd met my husband, it was at his prompting that he was like, you need to let them know what's going on. Like, you can't keep this secret from them. And I remember having to tell my mom and her just kind of looking at me like, you're lying. And I remember I was going to see a chiropractor at the time, post accident. And when I told him that I couldn't remember, he attributed it to the drug abuse that I had been sober for 2 years at that point, but he attributed that I'd relapsed and that I was just trying to get out of being with my family. So my mom got led to believe the same thing. And I was like, this is not what's happening. I don't even know what you're talking about. I didn't remember drug abuse. I didn't remember any of that. I was like, okay, I think what you want, but this is my truth. And it was challenging because to constantly have my mom say, don't you remember? Don't you remember? I'm like, no, I told you I don't remember. Like, are you thinking you're going to catch me in a lie? Like, no, I don't fucking remember. And it was so challenging, especially with my daughter, because trying to like keep up this front of, I know who you are, and yet I don't remember these things that you're talking about. And so between my mom and my daughter, they would constantly ask me, do you remember this? Do you remember that? Do you remember this? Do you remember that? And so for almost 2 years, that's how life was, is constantly trying to say, don't you remember? And it was like, no. And it's not that I don't want to remember, I just can't. The brain works in mysterious ways. So
So
it was a really,
you hadn't told them that you didn't remember, but yet all these conversations they had with you, they didn't connect it to that accident, huh?
no. And my daughter was 9 at the time. So I understand that. Like, it's like, well, why doesn't mommy remember like this and this and this? And my mom, like, when I finally told her, hey, I don't remember, she didn't believe me. She thought it was me lying because I was in this relationship now with the healthiest relationship I'd ever been in my life, mind you, with my husband. He was like actually a really decent guy who was treating me well, taking care of my mom and my daughter while I wasn't able to. And yet, because of that, I also was lost in him. I kind of lost myself, as a lot of couples do in the beginning. I lost myself in him and I felt safe. And so I was like, I'll just stick to him. This feels comfortable. That feels uncomfortable. So I gravitated away from my mom and my daughter. And they both told me that it actually was like they had truly experienced the loss of me, even though I was there.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
You mentioned the drug abuse.
Mhm.
Was that before the car accident or?
Yeah, I had from the time I was 17 until the time I was 29, so for 12 years, I was very heavily addicted. It started when I was in high school and I had some abuse happen to me, and then my dad got sick, and it was like the easiest way to was just to numb out. So that's what I did for 12 years. I was a very functioning addict, mind you, because I learned that in order to make sure people didn't know what was going on, I had to hide that part of myself. So I became very good at compartmentalizing things. But I didn't find that out again until I fully remembered everything. It started in 2000, late 2015 into 2019 is when I really focused a lot of time trying to learn who I was and what had happened, why it had happened. I was just trying to understand the past, but I wasn't living in the present. So,
I can relate to that,
yeah.
like many people probably can.
Mhm.
Um, so how old were you when your dad passed?
I was 21. So 10 years before my accident, my dad passed. And I was the last one to see him alive. The night he passed, he was in hospice, and I had been partying, and I got this like voice inside my head, this really small voice that said, "You need to go see your dad now." He had been in hospice for 7 days, and they had kept him comfortable, I guess is the best way to describe it. He had said, he had a DNR. He did not want to be resuscitated. He didn't want any of that. He didn't want any life-saving measures whatsoever. So he was literally on saline, and that was it for 7 days. And I remember now, looking back on it, that I had this voice say, "You need to go see him and just let him know that you love him and get it out." And so at 3 o'clock in the morning, I drove from the party I was at to the hospice, which was like 10 minutes away. And I went in to see him, and I sat down, and I literally just lost it all. Like I said everything that I'd ever needed to say in 21 years to him, knowing that he was not going to hear me specifically. Like his spirit would be there, but he wouldn't actually be able to respond to me. And I remember letting myself feel okay about that, because it was like, I'm finally going to get the last word. Like my dad was one of those people, you could never get the last word with him. And I had so much, as I'm sure you know, growing up with a parent well, I mean, you were younger, but even still in those first 8 years, I'm sure you might have experienced the PTSD. And that is really tough for a child to live with, to see their parent going through something and they don't understand why. And it's challenging. And so my dad and I did not have a great relationship, and we argued and fought a lot, and he loved me fiercely, but he was also very critical of me. And so that night I just sat there and I told him how I felt. And I let it all out, and I cried and I screamed at him and told him I hated him for leaving me. And then I told him that I loved him and that it was okay and that he could go. And I left and I went to a party, and I got a call 2 hours later. My mom said that he had passed. I was like, oh, he was waiting for me. So
I imagine that was very healing for you.
it was, and yet it was kind of surface level. Like I didn't really allow myself to feel it, because I didn't want to have to deal with it. It was like I just wanted to keep going and move on and be like, okay, it's gone, it's over with. My mom had grieved, but not visibly in any way that I knew how to see, like a healthy adult grieving. So she kept it. She always kept everything in, and it was like, I'm going to put it away in this file cabinet and I'm done. So that's what I learned to do. I was like, okay, I felt it. Now it's gone. I'm just going to ignore it. It's never going to come up again. I've learned that's not true. Mm-hmm. It will come up. You can't just file something away and expect it to be done. It's going to come back.
Eventually. Yeah, it always
eventually. Does. Yeah. And sometimes, usually in the worst possible time and moment. And so you're like, oh, well, darn. Well, that's there.
And quite often after we've experienced another loss.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And then everything floods, yes. Everything else comes back up to the surface.
Yes. And that is what kept me using. That is what kept me abusing drugs and alcohols, because my dad died when I was 21. And then after I had my daughter at 22, I found myself in a really abusive relationship. And I had a really close friend who was like my reason for like getting out of that relationship. He died right after my birthday when I was 23 in a very traumatic way. And then again, I didn't deal with it at all. Like I just tamped it down, started using I'm not gonna do it. And then when I was 25, my other best friend, both like brothers, died in another traumatic way. It all rushed back to me. And I said, nope, not dealing with it, tamped it down again. And it just kept going like that when I would have traumatic things, the loss of animals, the loss of people in my life. Then when I lost myself, that was when I finally had to start actually looking at it and start feeling it and dealing with it. And it's funny because like 2 weeks ago, I'd been originally scheduled to be with you, and I ended up losing my cat the day before he ended up dying of kidney failure. And it was one of those things where it was like it smacked me in the face so hard because I was no longer, I've been sober for 9 years now, and I wasn't going to misuse or abuse anything. So I was like, okay, I've got to feel this. And every single solitary grief that I had for 38 years hit me in the face. And it was like, whoa, that's a lot of grief.
So
And
sorry.
hey, thank you. I appreciate that. I kind of look at it as like an empowering lesson because it allowed me to finally feel it all. My apologies. It allowed me to finally feel it all. Something that I'd been hiding from for years. So every traumatic event, every grief that I ever felt, it was like I had to feel it finally. And I had to do it in a productive manner. I couldn't let myself, you know, hide it anymore. And it's so funny because it was at that moment that I realized how much healing I've actually done. Because I looked at my husband and I said, I know that in society they teach us, they show us on TV, they write it in books that if you have a traumatic experience and you're in a relationship, go have sex.
Mm.
Better. But that's a band-aid.
Mm-hmm.
And not to discredit the feeling better or the being intimate and actually like connecting with someone, say, oh, I'm happy, I'm alive. However, it's that we don't allow ourselves to fully feel that grief, and we shove it away. We mask it. We do something with it. And in this moment, I looked at him and said, we can't do that. We have to feel this pain. This was like a child to us. We have to feel this pain.
Well, and what do we do when we're doing that? It's this fear of connecting with ourselves. I think so many of us, when we're deep in grief, we almost detach ourselves
Mm-hmm.
from our hearts, our emotional selves, or we aren't even comfortable in our own skin and our own bodies.
Yep.
And like you just alluded to, like in almost every conversation I have with people on this podcast, it's like all of my guests get it. You really get it. You really get that these things that you've learned growing up have not been helpful on how we are taught to process and treat grief that we have in our lives and loss experiences. Because we're taught how to acquire things, but we're not taught what to do when we lose them.
Yeah,
And
definitely. That is so true.
that's why I'm so passionate about grief recovery and the work that I do. And that's why I started this podcast, for the educational piece, and you bring hope for people.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not a pile of mess on your floor. And when you are, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then be
Yeah.
honest about it. Like be
Mm-hmm.
honest with yourself about that.
Yep.
And what you need.
Yeah.
And congratulations on staying sober. 9
Thank
years.
you.
That's incredible.
Thank you.
So what did it look like for you these past 2 weeks? What have you been doing?
Well, the first thing that I've noticed is that there is a part of me that doesn't want to let me feel it. Like there's still this part of me that's like, no, I don't want to go there. It's unsafe. Don't feel that. Like, don't know. And I've found myself like having this like internal battle with I've come to know as my adolescent, because it's the adolescent or the ego self that is like, no, we're gonna skim over that. We're just gonna go and do whatever. Let's scroll on our Facebook. Let's do this. And I've had to like really just hold space for that part of myself and say it's okay to have this fear of feeling, but it's feeling that's going to allow you to not have to have fear anymore. because once you allow yourself to feel the feelings, it's gone. Yeah, it
Freedom.
might come up again when it gets triggered, and the more you work on it, the less it hurts. That is true, and I truly believe they say time heals all wounds. Yeah, as long as you're actually willing to acknowledge that that wound is there and you're willing to shine some light on it. Because if you don't, then it's just going to kind of sit in the shadows, and eventually it's like a tea kettle. It will tell you it's there.
I'm going to piggyback that because that's actually one of the myths of grief is time heals all wounds. Time does nothing but pass.
Mhm.
So, but you alluded to it's the action you take within time
Yes.
is what heals. The
Mhm.
action, not time
Yes.
itself, but the action. So,
Yes,
thank you
that's
for
very
bringing
true.
that up. Yes.
Of course. Yeah,
Um,
and that's so true because they say just like I think about my mom, and she's been single now for 17 years. And to this day, and I love my mother immensely. She is one of my biggest heroes. But to this day, she still says that she's married to my dad. She'll say I'm married to a dead man. And like, that's because you haven't allowed yourself to actually feel the grief of what it is that lost. You got stuck back then.
mhm.
And there's no judgment from me on that. It's the truth. It's what she did. And I'm like, how, living a half life to me, the way that I've seen it is like she's happy, but there's still a sadness there because she's never fully allowed herself to feel the sadness of that loss. And I'm sure that there's much loss compared more than just that. That's just the most recent. And then of course there's what I went through, and how she felt like she lost me. So it's interesting because yeah, time hasn't healed that wound for her because she's not done anything with it. She's just kind of, okay, it's there. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna leave it there in that little filing cabinet locked up.
May I ask how the communication has been between your mom and you since during all these years of, what you kind of were struggling yourself, but yet, the ripple effect of that impacted her life, of course. So
Mhm.
how has the communication been around that?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, there really was not ever a lot of communication around the loss of my dad. I didn't even actually know much besides the fact that he had cancer and he was dying. That's all I knew. They never told me. It was like, protect her, keep her safe. She doesn't need to know this. But that in and of itself actually led me to rebel because at 18 years old, when you find out your parent's sick and they don't want to tell you anything and they say, oh, no, no, we're going to be fine. And then you're seeing, especially as someone who's so empathic like myself, I'm literally watching my dad and seeing him waste away. I'm like, no, he's not fine, but why won't you tell me? And
Mhm.
so there was a lot of disconnect there, and and when he did pass, we just kind of left it. Like occasionally we would talk about him on a holiday or if something came up, but for the most part we never really brought him up until the last few years. The last few years I've talked a lot more about him. I've talked a lot more about my own grief. I've allowed my mom to know how I was feeling around things, and that has been probably one of the most healing things I feel that we've gone through, because when I went through my accident and she didn't have the daughter that she had grown to know and all of these things, it really caused a rift in our relationship. And it took me, to speak to the ripple effect, it took me actually going and doing the work on myself. And the more I showed up differently, then she started showing up differently. And so now she's a lot more open, and the communication between us is amazing. Um, and we don't talk as much. Um, we used to talk every day, like for hours. Um, However, when we do talk, it's meaningful and we do spend time. And though I do know that it's challenging for her, because even to the point of like when I told her I was changing my name, it was like, oh, so you're not the you once were. And it took her probably about a year and a half to actually start not screwing up. Like she would call me by the name she had called me by for years. And then I'm like, Mom, this is my name. And then I let it go for a while, and she would screw up, and I'm like, Mom, this is my name. And finally it was like, okay. And I told her, I said, look, I'm legally changing it. Like, but it has, I'm honoring the me that I once was by using my first name that I was born with as my middle name. So it's still I'm still here. It's just, I'm different. I'm healthier, actually. Like, I look at the me before the accident and I'm like, man, I was really unhealthy. And I was actually probably on the road to relapse. So the accident really saved my life.
Wow.
So,
In I think it's only been the last 2 weeks. Yeah, it has been. Yours is the second story of name change that I've heard.
oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was on another podcast. I had a guest by the name of Victoria Shaw on my
Mhm.
podcast, and on her podcast, she had a gal that does numerology readings,
Mhm.
and she had changed her name
Oh.
and had spoken about that and
Mhm.
talked about the significance of our name, of our
Mhm.
birth given
Yeah.
name,
Mhm.
and the self identity that we kind of
Mm.
have,
Mhm.
and either a good way or a negative way.
Yeah.
I imagine with life experience, things, we can change how we feel about our name.
Mhm.
I actually changed my name too. I didn't change it, but I go by a different name.
Mhm.
Um, I was always Vicky growing up. Everyone
Mhm.
always called me Vicky, except when I upset my mother, it would be Victoria, Victoria
Mhm.
Lynn. The first, middle,
Yep.
say the whole name
Mhm.
when they're mad. Um, but yeah, I go by Victoria now, and it feels more fitting for me. So I resonate with that idea of, it's almost like a coat we put on.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so can you
Yeah.
share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's actually funny that you mentioned that, like, how growing up you changed it from Vicky to Victoria, because growing up I was Nikki, and then in high school I was like, nope, it's Nicole. And then after that, I actually went by another name when I was partying. So, like, I had two names, and then I went back to being Nicole before the accident. And after the accident, I actually shortened it to a nickname for Nicole, Coley, because I was like, Nicole didn't feel right. It didn't roll off my tongue and feel like who I was. So I was like, okay, I'll go back Coley. It's really interesting. But then it just sort of shifted into Chandra. And that's when I took on Chandra Nicole. And it was interesting because for me, it was a very smooth transition. It always throughout, because now that I do remember why I would go by different names throughout time, it was just a very smooth transition. Like, even as a child, I never felt comfortable as Nicole or Nikki or any of it. I hopped around spellings, all of that. So it just never sat with me. It was like, okay. And it's funny because my mom actually told me, like, they were thinking about a completely different name before I actually showed up. Like, they had planned out all these other names, and Nicole was not even one of the names. It was supposed to be Katrina. And I'm like, well, I could have resonated with Katrina more than I could Nicole, but okay. But it was interesting because my husband picked up really easily on calling me Chandra. Um, and it was even, even my friends, a lot of them have really just been, there's some that still try to call me by the name that I was. And I'm like, no, that's not my name. Like, I would appreciate it if you call it me this. And it's also funny because, like, I get a lot of people calling me Chandra. And I'm like, no, it's not Chandra, it's Chandra. But I
And you're thinking like
remember,
Nicole would have been a lot easier.
right? Yes, exactly. It really was. It was like, ugh. And it's interesting though, because at the beginning, when there were certain people in my life that I was not opposed to them calling me my former name or by miss saying the name I use now. And then as time moved on and I was really feeling more and more in my identity of Chandra, it was like, no, I'm not going to accept anybody not saying that right. So, like, I'm gonna correct you in a kind way, but I'm going to correct you and no, this is the name. And I also have reversed it, and I will always ask anyone that I'm speaking to, what would you like to be called?
Mhm.
Because I can understand, like, not being called what you want to be called. Um, to that effect, actually, I recently just saw a post I made about 2 years ago about transgender individuals and their dead name versus the name they choose. And I was like, why is it that we have such a problem calling people the name that they asked to be called? Like, why? Why do we have such a, and it's a bound identity, is we get to know someone as they are, and we just expect them to continue being that person. So whether they change their name, they realize that they are in the wrong body and are fully expressing themselves in the way that they want to be seen, whatever it is, we struggle as a culture, as a society, with accepting the people, knowing that they know who they are over who we think they are.
Yeah, a lot of projection.
Oh, yes. And it's so interesting because I myself, I am a Celtic pagan, and I look back on my ancestors, my Nordic ancestors and the Vikings and a lot of the older tribes type. They didn't choose names for their kids. They actually waited a couple of years to let their kids' personalities start to show up and then found a name for them. So they would just call them cute nicknames. And then the kid got
Interesting.
to choose themselves. Yeah. So I think
Which
it's,
you also did.
yeah, I did. I did.
Ultimately, yeah.
Yep. That's exactly what I did.
It's almost as if like it's this you lived you experienced the life into your name.
hmm Yeah. And it came to me in a meditation, so it felt right. I was like, oh, okay, cool.
I love that. Intuition is our
Huge.
intuition is always speaking to us.
Yes, it is.
So there's another loss though that you haven't touched on yet that I know that you put in the information you sent to
hmm
me. It is with your husband.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. So he was in the military as well. And about 4 months into our relationship, he suffered a pretty big brain injury. He was playing for the military lacrosse team and took a 75-mile-an-hour ball to the face. Now he had his helmet on, but it broke his helmet and still hit him, and it knocked him down, and um, it changed him. And he was no longer the man that I first met. And over the course of the last few years, his personality has completely shifted as well. So he's very much, there's things that I look at him like, oh, there he is. And then I look at it and I'm like, but it doesn't, it's kind of like it mirrors in a lot of ways my journey of how I came to be me with him coming to be him. Because it was probably 5 months difference between when I experienced my brain injury and then he experienced his. So it was like we were kind of on concurrent paths of healing. But we were healing in different ways, and it was very challenging because a lot of his trauma that he had not known about started to show up, and it really he ended up going. I went from being his wife to being his caregiver, and I had to put wife on the back burner because he wasn't the man that, I mean, it didn't feel good in any way to be in the role of wife with him when he himself was still very childlike.
Mm.
And thankfully, he's recovered to a point that he's not as childlike. There's still times when he needs me to remind him because he can't remember things. He doesn't know, medication or me handling like doctors and things like that. But he has done a lot of healing, thankfully, to a point where we can actually start to be partners again. But that was really, I was afraid I was never going to get that. I was afraid that I had lost him forever, and that was just going to be one more grief that I'd have to experience and accept and continue to survive through.
But it's still grief, right? Because it's not it. In the Grief Recovery Institute, the definition of grief is the loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations, and anything we wish that would have been different, better, or more. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very happy to hear that he seems to be healing. It's coming along.
Mm-hmm.
Yet at the same time, um, don't minimize that there's still
Yeah.
that, you don't want to minimize that there's still that grief
Yes.
there, that
Yeah.
what could be, or what, I mean,
Mhm.
we don't want to
No.
stay stuck there either, right?
Yeah. I totally get that. And I actually did for a while because in the process of him having this personality shift, one of the things that shifted was he realized that he was polyamorous and that he desired, while having a stable and loving marriage with me, he desired having other partners, not just sexual, but like emotional partners. And when he came out to me with that, it was literally, it like rocked my world, because I'm sitting here going, we had planned our life a certain way. And not only had I lost a lot of that because of his brain injury and how he changed, but now I'm like, is this even what I want? Do I even want to be with someone who wants to be with more than just me? Like all I literally, I said to him so many times, you can't tell me that. One of the things we used to say when we first met is that while we may have had firsts, we were each other's lasts. And then after the brain injury and he started to shift, one of the things he was like, he actually, I remember him saying this to me sometime last year after he came out to me about being polyamorous, is he said to me, as long as I'm coming home to you at the end of the night, that's all that matters. I may experience my last with somebody else, but if I come home to you and you're the person that I end up, passing next to, you're still, that's me and you. And I'm like, okay, but no, because we said we were going to be each other's last. We said we were going to do XYZ. We said we were going to do all of these things. How can we do that now? It felt like I was losing us. And in a lot of ways I had, because of circumstance. And so this last, and then of course with COVID and everything, it was kind of like it was kind of a little miracle, because it was like, okay, now you can't do that right now. So we got to figure this stuff out between us and then get to a good place. And thankfully, I've used COVID for that for sure, to really help us like heal and get on a good path to where I'm like, you know what, I don't feel a lot of the grief that I had felt. What I realized is that he was so much like my dad, and I was kind of looking at him to like fill the role of what I missed growing up. And he filled it, and then all of a sudden it was gone again. And so it re-triggered all of that like traumatic of there one day, gone the next. And so it really took me on this journey of having to dive really deep inside myself and find out, okay, what's showing up for me? Where is this coming from? How can I heal this so that it's not affecting me daily, day in and day out, and I can actually have the life that I desire living?
So how have you done that?
Oh, so a lot of parts work, a lot of inner child work, a lot of energy healing too. As I'm sure you're familiar with being a Reiki master, energy
Hallelujah.
is everything. And realizing that there was so much stuck, like I had so
Mhm.
much. And actually in 2020 is when I fully remembered all of my life. Like it was just like in an instant click, and it was like, okay, I was like, and I know that it wasn't an instant. I know it was it was all the 6 years of healing that I had gone through, all the energy work, all the inner child work, everything. But it was just like in a moment, it's just like one day it just poof, it made sense, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm here now, and I remember. And now that I remember, I can actually like, it felt like coming home to myself.
Mhm.
It's really like the best way to describe it. And it was like,
I agree.
oh, now I understand. Now I have context. It's so funny because it felt for the first 6 years, it felt very much like being a child, because I couldn't remember. I would have things come up and I was like, I don't have any context about this. What the heck? And then I'd have to go in and do some healing around it. And then I'd find the context. I was like, oh, okay. And it was like kind of like updating old computer programs. It's like, now I understand why that's happening. Let's update this. This is really what's going on in the year 2020 or the year 2021. So it's been a lot of that. And
It's
yeah.
it's like you have this loose thread in a
Mhm.
blanket, and you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling until
Mhm.
everything, and or likewise, it's like you keep creating over and over. You just evolving yourself and
Mhm.
recreating yourself. And
Yes.
it's path to self-discovery is really what it is. And I
Yeah.
say it all the time, but grief is cumulative and it's
Mhm.
cumulatively negative, but healing is cumulatively positive.
Oh,
Because
yes.
every step you take, everything you're doing, all the modalities, you stack them up, you bring them together, and yeah, like very much like you, like it's this.
Mhm.
I've had stuff come up that I didn't even know
Mhm.
through doing Reiki work.
Mhm.
It's been a phenomenal addition to my life. It found me. I had no
Mhm.
idea what the heck it was.
Yeah.
Hadn't
Yeah.
even had a session, and I went and got certified. Reiki level 1 and 2, and then I went for my master, and then I added on Karuna, and it's been a phenomenal addition to my life, as
Oh,
I
yeah.
see in yours as well.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, and to that part, it's so funny because what I realized in my mom, when I went and got Reiki certified, I did the full 1, 2, and master teacher in a 6-month time span. Probably less than that because you need the 21 days. I literally only let myself do the 21 days in between, and then I went and got the next one. Um, and one of the things is my mom actually said to me, she's like, well, you realize as a child, you used to do this. You'd go and you put your hands on people and tell them you're sending them love and light. And I was like, I did? So I was a healer as a little kid, except back then I didn't understand that it wasn't my energy because I was always depleted. I was sick so much in my childhood. And I never understood because they would get these random weird things happening. It's like, well, how is she getting so sick? Her body is completely fine. And all of a sudden she shows up sick. So I was taking on other people's stuff. I didn't realize it. So when I became attuned, that was like, oh, I can let it all go. It's not mine. It's source coming through me. Okay, that's cool. So it started me to allow me to start letting things go that weren't even mine that I'd been holding on to for decades.
same. As a kid, I needed so much sleep. I have so many pictures of me. I don't have a lot of
Yes.
pictures, but like three-fourths of the pictures I do have, which fit in a Ziploc sandwich bag,
Hmm.
are of me sleeping.
Hmm.
And there's actually one of my most favorite pictures of me and my dad. He was already sick or had been diagnosed already, because he was stage 4 when they found it. But
Hmm.
there's a picture of me in my like doctor garb. I'm in my Garfield long pajama gown, and I got my blue cap, and I got rubber gloves on, and I'm like on my dad's back, and I'm like playing doctor. I'm
Uh-huh.
trying to fix him, you know,
Yeah.
and so that your share there really
Hmm.
that sparked that memory in me.
Yeah,
So thank you for that. But
of
um,
course.
so in looking in what you do, like so I imagine like myself, everything you've experienced has been just like the stepping stone. It's like the
Hmm.
next natural progression into the work that you're doing.
Yep.
I would say the work that I do as well. So tell me more about the work that you do.
So recently I've actually been trying to find a way to like meld it all together because it feels like it's like I spread it out too much. I'm like, and of course that's my thinker brain going, you need to have specifics. Everybody's got to know exactly what it is you're doing. um and then I think about like my intuitive self. I'm like, no, they don't need to, you can describe it as best you can and then let them experience it, and then it goes from there. So I've recently started shifting what I was originally calling my coaching sessions are now I call soul birth sessions. And so what I consider myself is to be like a spiritual midwife to help women transform their selves into the life that they truly desire, like the life that they really want, rather than the life that they were told that they are supposed to have. Like I remember being growing up, you're going to grow up, you're going to go to school, you're going to meet someone, you're going to get it, get a job, meet someone, get married, have kids, and die. That's And I was like, that doesn't sound very fun. That's like not a very fun existence. Like what? So in uncovering what I truly wanted to do for myself and be of service to others and really find my truth and my authenticity, I was able to start seeing that I actually am really good at guiding others to do that too. So that's what I've been working on. I've been working on creating this soul-based business where I actually guide others to do the same type of stuff that I've done for myself.
I love that. Um, so what has given you the most joy, other than the work that you're doing now? What has given you the most joy and hope for your future?
Mm. Um, so for sure, I have to say my daughter. Um, Even though it's been challenging because they themselves came out to me as non-binary and as a lesbian in the last couple of years. So shifting and like realizing that this is what my mom went through with me is like what I'm going through now with my daughter. And yet having such joy and such happiness around the fact that this, teenage kid feels good to be able to be themselves. Like that gives me so much joy that I loved them enough that they felt comfortable to truly be themselves. Like as much as my mom loved me, I didn't feel comfortable being myself growing up. I had to hide who I was. And to know that I have this kiddo that I've actually done a really great job raising and that they feel good about being themselves enough to the point that they chose me to be the one they came out to first. And they've always been just like amazing. And so that really brings me a lot of joy to know that I've done a really good job as a parent. And then being able to be creative. My family is just part of that joy, of course, but then being able to be a creative individual. I'm very artistic and I love to express that art in whatever ways show up for me. So I've been really focusing on a lot of that finding that creative joy again so that I can actually live from that place. Because for a very long time, I didn't live there. In fact, I just kind of shut it down. So, yeah.
I love that. That's something I wish to get back to more of is just this
Mhm.
creative play. Just following the curiosity, right? I
Yes.
talk about that with a lot of friends I have is just follow the curiosity wherever it leads you.
Hmm.
And I love that you brought up about your child and how, yeah, I mean, to create that space for someone else to really be themselves. And
Hmm.
obviously you're a wonderful example of that, of living your truth and
Thank you.
who you really want to be in this
Yeah.
world and what you want to give to others.
Hmm.
Um, what is one tip that you would give someone who's hurting today?
One tip, I feel like
There could be
probably,
more. There
yeah,
could be more.
I feel like the biggest thing is don't judge yourself. Allow yourself to feel the grief, like in however it shows up, but also don't live in that. Like find a way to move through it. Like it's okay to me personally, whenever I have a loss, specifically one where it's someone who's passed on, I try to focus remembering all the good times that I had with them because it's those good times. They don't want us to mourn them. They want us to remember them. At least that's what I feel is like being able to bring them the joy that they brought to you to continue to hold that and focus on that. Focus on the joy of having of what it was such a joy to have them in your life. Like I think about my cat, like, yeah, it was sudden and I hated it happening. But then I think about all the joy that he gave me. And he wouldn't want me to sit there and spend hours and hours and weeks and months and years ruminating on the loss of him. He'd want me to live life for him. And to that end, that's actually something that my husband and I promised each other when we got married is that instead of how so many people would say, I'll die for you, live for me. So we promised that we would live for each other. So if anything ever happened, we wouldn't stop living. We would continue on in their honor. And so that's the advice I would give is honor honor the relationship you had with that person by remembering all the joy.
Can I follow that up with the relationship you had with your father then? If it was kind of a challenging relationship?
Mhm.
How did you do that then?
Oh, well, it took me a while. I had to, it's funny that I look back on it now and go, oh, I was living the stages of grief over like many, many years because I was angry for a really long time. And then after the anger, I started realizing, like, how am I living my life to honor him? Like, he wouldn't, what was it that he wanted me to do in life, to achieve in life? And so I started living it from that point of view. And then once I started doing the work of the spiritual work and really working with meditation and things like that, I went in and I actually called on his spirit, and I had conversations with him. And to hear him say to me how proud he was of me, apologies, how proud he was of me, and how, just how I'm living life from this joyous place and that it's all he ever wanted, that was able to allow me to see that everything that happened in our human existence, when we pass and we go into the spirit world, that's gone. That we leave that, like, we leave it at the door, just as like, okay, I'm going to check that here, I don't need it anymore, I'm in spirit form, everything is good. So it's like I was able to go in and act and talk to him and really have those connections, and find out how much he truly loved me, and really feel it in my everyday life of like seeing little signs from him that, I look and I see over. My mom and I used to say, when after my dad passed, we saw crows everywhere. So seeing a crow, I'm like, oh, my dad's thinking of me today. Smelling his cologne, how I remember the scent of his cologne 17 years later, I have no clue. I haven't smelled it in the 17 years. But if I'm in my room and all of a sudden I smell it and I'm like, oh, my dad's here. He's watching over me. He's making sure that I'm okay. Yeah.
You make me think of I just got turned on to this Netflix docu-series called Surviving Death.
Uh-huh.
Have you heard of it?
I haven't.
You are speaking the language of what that's all about.
Oh, wow.
It's a 6-part docu-series. I think you'd be interested in watching
I'll
that.
check it
But
out.
there's one that's actually called Signs.
Mm-hmm.
But I almost wonder sometimes, this is just my own inner thought pondering,
Mm-hmm.
um, that if we had like a very conflicted life in our human form,
Mm-hmm.
is that somewhat still resonant in our soul form, in our spirit form? And that's one thing that you made me think of too as I heard you talking, like, and I don't know. This is, like I said, this is just me, my inner
Yeah.
dialogue. Is
Mm-hmm.
that because I think that's why sometimes spirits, because I do totally absolutely believe in ghosts,
Mm-hmm.
and that sometimes they just have to make their presence known, or they cannot
Mm-hmm.
move on, in that they got something unfinished,
Oh, yeah.
you know?
I totally agree with you on that. Ever since I was a little kid, I was always very sensitive to the spirit world. And there are definitely times when, if it is like a highly traumatic situation that they passed in, or even if it's something where they feel a lot of grief because they were leaving their family and they didn't want to, or whatever, I find that it's those highly emotional, whether it's the quote good or bad emotion, but it's the highly emotional times. That's when sometimes the spirits will get stuck. And I feel like those that have been able to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, they don't have any unfinished business. Like, when they talk about it on movies and things like that, like, oh, he has unfinished business. Yeah, like sometimes we do. Like, if we, like my best friend who fell 40 stories to his death, like, he had a lot of unfinished business. Like, I'm pretty sure he was not ready to go. And so I'm sure that there's times when people feel like, oh, hey, like, I can actually feel his presence, and it's more of like, not in a way of which I've moved on, but more of a like, I'm kind of still here, like like there's something that's unfinished for me. And I feel like, as someone who I consider myself a medium, I know that if you can, sometimes those spirits just need to have someone as a vehicle, is to be their voice and let them know, I'm okay. I loved you. I meant to tell you this. I never got to. And then the moment that's done, then they can peacefully go on to their next existence. I truly believe that to be the case.
Yeah, I think this is a like veered into a topic that we could probably talk for hours on.
Probably.
Yeah, it's really deep, but I love deep conversation.
Yeah.
So what would you say overall that your grief has taught you?
To live.
That's good.
Thank you. I truly feel as if I was given a second chance, and so many of us don't get that chance. At least not in a like we have an accident and then well we don't get that chance anymore. So I've really taken this as what do I want to do? How do I want to live my life now so that I don't worry, when I get to that point of finally being old, because I know I'm going to live to a very right old age. I don't want to get to that age and be like, man, what did I do with my life? When I look back on the me that I was before the accident, and I realized I had kind of come to that place. I was because I was so traumatized with all that I had gone through, because of everything, I had just come to a place where I was like, you know what? Life isn't good. I'm not really ever going to have what I want. It was just a very depressing, very down, dark place. And I didn't think it could ever change. And it did. And I'm grateful for that, because what it did was it woke me up to realize that I was so stuck in all of the grief and the loss and that I didn't focus on what I actually had right in front of me, which was this amazing life that I could literally choose to do anything with, so long as I allowed myself to do so. And part of that, in order to do that, is I had to heal all that was keeping me stuck in the darkness. And now that I'm like, oh, I see that, I choose to say I want to live a different life. I want to be happy. I want to experience everything that I've set out to experience. And it doesn't know it, I want to live. And it's kind of funny, because that actually goes to the point that I used to make to a lot of people. I said, the meaning of life is to live it. Like, everyone wonders what the meaning of life is. It's to live it, to experience it, to enjoy it. That's the meaning of life. So that's what I'm choosing to do.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Because I don't know that we completely answered it, and I want to share anything good that you have to share around the topic. And it goes back to your addiction. And what was there a defining moment, or what was the one thing, like, I mean, because 12 years is a long time. So what was the one thing, or was there one thing that got you out of that?
So it's funny because and during those 12 years, I did try to get sober numerous occasions. And I even stayed sober for, 6 months to a year sometimes. But then I'd always have something come back and smack me in the face. And what it was at the very end, I remember this. It was, I'd been sober for a year almost. And then I met some friends, and my mom ended up, I was away on a cruise that I had been wanting to go on my entire life. I was a huge Backstreet Boys fan. I will not deny it. I will own it. And I got to go on the cruise. The last day of the cruise, my mom slipped and fell and broke her knee. And my daughter had been with her, and when my mom called me and said to me, "Are you sitting down?" when I was in the airport, and told me, like, the first thought was I thought something happened to my daughter, and she was like, "No, she's fine." And then I was like, okay. And she's like, it's actually me. And it triggered back everything, all of that grief from my dad of being like my mom. I almost lost my mom, all these things. And I was like, am I going to be alone? And so I lost the sobriety that I'd had up to that point. I started drinking and doing drugs again with some friends. And I went out on New Year's Eve, and I woke up probably 12 to 13 hours into the new year, and I didn't know where I was. I didn't know the person's bed I was in. I didn't know anything. I later came to find out that they had actually went joyriding with my car, like all of these different things. And I was like, I sat up and I was like, what the hell are you doing with your life? Like you're sabotaging yourself. You're creating more of this existence that you say you don't want because you're afraid of dealing with the truth. And the truth is you're unhappy. It was like, oh, okay. Well, if I'm unhappy, what do I need to do in order to get happy? And I got really quiet and I heard myself say, you need to get sober. Like I heard this voice and it sounded like my dad, honestly, saying, you've got to grow up. You can't be a kid. You can't continue to live in this victimhood that you've created for yourself. You need to be there for your daughter. And it was in that moment when I realized, like, what am I did to my daughter inadvertently by being an addict, what my dad had done to me by being a long haul truck driver. He left me alone for 7 years, or yeah, over 7 years. I rarely ever saw him. And I was doing the same thing to my daughter that my dad had done to me. And it was in that moment that I realized, what am I doing? Am I creating another generation that's going to go through what I went through? Is that what I really want to be doing? I realized how unhealthy I was and that I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. Like it wasn't healthy. I wasn't healthy. And if I wanted to actually be there for my daughter and make 30, I had to get sober and like actually get sober and completely walk away from everything that had allowed me to continue to be there. And so I did. I actually picked up. I have not touched a single thing since that day. And I walked away and I said, okay, let's figure out how we're going to heal. Let's head straight into the darkness now, but let's do this in a constructive manner. So that's what I did.
Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations again.
Thank you. Well, and I think the thing that's most important, if I can, is to say that I look at myself now, and I look at the girl who wasn't sober, and I forgave her. And in fact, I told her I was proud of her because I kept myself alive. For 12 years, when there was a part of me that just wanted to give up and die, I found a way to survive until I could learn to thrive. And that is so important. It's okay to not it's okay to feel like you can't go on, but find one thing that can help you to get to the point and just keep following those little breadcrumbs and you'll get there. But have grace with yourself. Like I had to have grace with myself and be like, you know what? I look at all of these things as they helped create who I am. And I'm happy to be the woman that I am today. And I wouldn't change any of it, no matter how traumatic or how, lost I might have felt. It got me to where I am now. And I'm grateful for that.
I love that. And I had a thought. What was it?
Sorry.
I'm gonna have to edit this. See, this is why I write notes as people talk, so I can come back to the thoughts I have. And I didn't write it down because I was so into the conversation.
I apologize.
No, it's not you. I just really appreciate all that you've shared because I think it really just comes back to there's one common theme. There's one theme that I've kind of picked up on among all conversations that I've had, especially when it comes to addiction. And I don't care what the vice is shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Shame really keeps us in the dark.
Oh, definitely. And the thing of it is, what I didn't realize is that shame is what led me to gain all the weight that I gained multiple times, because I was afraid of feeling. So I felt shame in that I was feeling all these things. So how do you do it? You just shove the shame down. So I'm just going to push you down. And that was the thing, is addiction. Like you said, it doesn't matter what the addiction is, because you can be a workaholic, you can be a drug or alcohol abuser, you could be an emotional or any other type of disordered eating. Like there's so many different, gambling, all of these things, they all have the same root, is that we don't feel worthy of something. And that's where that shame comes in. I feel ashamed of, I'm not worthy, but we're all worthy.
But
We're
what
all
happened, right? What
yeah.
happened? What's at the root? What happened?
Yes.
Trauma is what happens. Grief
Mm-hmm.
is what's left.
Yes, exactly. And it's getting to the core of those roots and saying, okay, you know what? I'm not going to get down on you for feeling that way. I'm going to acknowledge this. This is what it is. You feel this, and let's honor that, and then let's move on, and let's find a way to heal the root, because if we don't heal the root, it's like putting a band-aid. And that's what I did. I went from you know from drugs and alcohol to sex to eating to gambling to working to all of these different things, because I was afraid of getting to the root of what was really pushing me. And then once I got to the root, it was like, oh, well, that's not so bad.
Yeah, it's we resist what we resist persists.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
where our focus is where we are. And
Yes.
Yeah. I want to ask, hold on one second. Okay. We kind of covered that. I was just kind of looking at the part where you said versus how I once did when I was still learning, like the process of how you were
Mm-hmm.
healing and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you this. Okay, one final question.
Okay.
So, I talked about how healing is cumulative as well. So, what have been some of the modalities other than energy work that
Mm-hmm.
that have helped you? And I know I think you said meditation as well, which
Yeah.
I'm a huge proponent of too.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
So I'm a big fan of parts work, and specifically the modality that really kind of brought that around to me, because I had a background in psychology. I just have forgotten some of it. And so it's called the adult chair. I'm actually being certified as a coach in this modality. And what it is she basically broke down where things sit, whether it's in the inner child, the adolescent, or the adult. Well, and for the adult, it's really the healthiest version of myself and the healthiest adult I can be versus a unhealthy adult. Because when we're unhealthy adults, we're really sitting in like adolescent and inner child stuff, just showing up with these masks. So being able to learn that I had these parts of myself that I needed to heal, and going and being able to like update it like an old program and update the programming was really a beneficial modality for me. I also became trained in Akashic Records work. And then I have used other types of modalities that I'm not trained in, but that I've gone and sought out, like cranial sacral therapy, which was absolutely pivotal for really getting to be able to release some of the blocks in my brain specifically. They use cranial sacral therapy a lot for head injuries, because it's a great modality to be able to really release some of the stuckness that happens, and the imbalance that can actually happen internally. I used the emotion code. So I've done some emotion code sessions, which I found were really empowering. The Reiki energy. I think those were the main things that I did. Just a lot of the healing modalities, and even Chinese medicine, like finding holistic doctors so that I could heal what was showing up as like actual physical things, and find, is it actually my body having something happen, or is it emotion connected to the body and it's showing up that way?
Yes, and I don't know, I'm sure I see this all the time in my Reiki sessions where it's grief manifests and
Mm-hmm.
it manifests in what we do, how we
Mm-hmm.
behave, and
Yes.
how our bodies show up for us. And
Yeah.
we almost feel like sometimes that we are at battle with our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Really, it's upstairs in our
Mm-hmm.
minds is where the
Yeah.
battle really is. Yeah.
And that is so true. And that's one of the biggest things that I've learned, is that if we ignore the emotion, it's like a little kid, it's going to keep poking at you and it will find a way to get your attention. And a lot of times, because emotions can get stuck in the body, it'll show up, it'll manifest itself in the way of like pain, or so a lot of people who have, for example, fibromyalgia, if they go and do, which is, I forgot, I've done tapping, EFT, emotional freedom technique. And so if you go and you do that type of work where you're actually allowing you're speaking it, but also letting the body move it, then a lot of times they find, oh, I don't have that pain anymore. Or that thing that was bothering me, if I haven't been speaking my voice and I all of a sudden have, you know, thyroid issues, and I start speaking my voice and doing healing, and then suddenly the thyroid issue is gone. That's what happened with me. I was like, okay, so that's it. It does. It shows up in our body in weird ways, and we're like, oh, okay, cool. You know, like I
All
think
connected.
it is, and I think as I'm sure as you know, as a Reiki practitioner, this is one of the first books that I found was Louise Hay, is the Body Heals Itself, and she talks about that, and that connection of the body, it's showing up physically when it's an emotion or a feeling.
Yeah, she actually healed herself of cancer,
Mm-hmm.
of
Yep.
a female, I believe, uterine,
Mm-hmm.
one of the female organs. She had
Mm-hmm.
cancer. Yeah, that was actually one of the first books early on. I think like in 2014 that I had come across when
Mm-hmm.
my healing started. When I really started to dig into my own healing, and it
Yeah.
creates ripples as
Oh, it
I'm
does.
our healing of ourselves creates ripples in our lives, as I know you've
It
experienced, I'm
does.
sure.
And not only in our lives, like in our current everyday life, but even going back in generation ancestral. Like I've done some ancestral work with different modalities of ancestral. Like I think there's like generational healing is one of the ones I did. And like when you heal yourself, you are literally healing up to 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So it's like, okay, there's the incentive right there to heal yourself, is you don't just heal you, but you heal your family. And
That's
all
the
of us
thought.
have some sort of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the thought I couldn't think of to come back to was when you take the time to invest in yourself and in your own healing, you break the cycle.
Yes.
You
Mm-hmm.
break that cycle of that generational learning, which we talk about in grief recovery too. It's
Mm-hmm.
all generational. Because we
Yeah.
resort to what we know. And when
Yeah.
we understand ourselves better and we're living in integrity with
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, changes everything.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I think that's it. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to
I
have me on.
absolutely, I love this conversation. I think, yeah, we could talk for hours, I'm sure of it. I'm going to link to everything that was mentioned in the show notes, the different
Okay.
healing modalities. Where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
So I have a website called I Got the Woo, IGOTTHEWOO.com.
Clever, clever, love that.
Yes. Yes. It came about after my certification program. Like we were on our way back and she actually, like, I happened to say, I got the woo. And my friend's like, that's you. That is so you. That's what you need to use. And I've just ran with it. So, um, and then I am on Instagram at Celtic Healer Chandra. So it's CELTIC and then healer and then SHANDRA. And I'm on Facebook as Healings of Light and Love. So when you do the backslash, healings of light and love. And that's my business page.
Perfect. And I will link to those as well. Thank you again for being here, for sharing your stories of many stories of loss. This is a beautiful example of all the different types of loss that we can experience in, I mean, you probably feel like you've lived like 3 lifetimes.
Or more, yeah. Yep. I say like I'm like a cat. I've got the 9 lives, and how many do I have left?
Yeah. And two, I just want to bring up too, just acknowledge that the loss of your cat, because pet loss and miscarriage are 2 of the most minimized losses.
Oh, yes.
And regardless of the relationship of who it is or what it is, there was a relationship there, and it
Oh, yeah.
deserves to be honored. And so
Yeah.
thank you for bringing that up as well as one of your
Of
losses
course.
to talk about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I've had a lot of pet loss, so I've kind of learned to move through it, but it's also one of those things like I've come to realize that I would not want to miss out on any of that. It's just like every moment that I have with all the different people in my life, I would never want to miss out by not having that experience. And so it's like in the moment, it's really sad to lose them, but that's why I think back on all like the night with my cat. I had him for 9 years. Like I have 9 years of him being by my side and just loving me and all of that. I focus on that rather than focus on the loss. And that allows me to say, you know what? I'm not going to stop myself from letting another animal come into my life in the future just because I'm afraid of the loss. Because with animals, of course, we don't get as much time as we get with humans, usually. So, yeah.
Thank you so much again for being here. And remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.